Though I'm all about seeing all movies in theaters, it's not every time that I go to the cinema that I feel like I've had a truly cinematic experience. After waiting 6 years for his fifth and final Daniel Craig outing as James Bond,
There's no hurry, you see. We have all the time in the world.
and now having finally seen it, I can say it was well worth the wait. Not only because I'm a huge James Bond fan, but because it was that true, rare cinematic experience. The fact that this movie also never feels like a CGI fest makes that accomplishment all the more impressive, in my opinion. As with the previous four Craig Bonds, everything in No Time to Die feels grounded and real. The fact that the film maintains such a sense of realism while also simultaneously still feeling as grand and epic as any other blockbusters from the last decade, I would say, is something that I would say hasn't really been achieved since Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight Rises. Really, the entire Dark Knight trilogy. Some may criticize the fact that the most recent 007 adventures have been heavily inspired by Christopher Nolan's style of filmmaking, but to that I say, why the hell shouldn't they be? Down to the booming Hans Zimmer score in this film, it's a style that fits a modern take on James Bond kind of perfectly. To be fair, I mean, Nolan films like the Dark Knight trilogy, Inception, and Tenet are heavily inspired by classic Bond films such as On Her Majesty's Secret Service, so it's rather poetic now that his new Bond films, the new Christopher Nolan movies, inspire the new Bond movies. And even if you look back at like The Dark Knight, the Joker has like the knife come out of his shoe, that's just like in our Brosa Club and For Martial Love. So I was hoping for this film, of course, to be the perfect send-off to Daniel Craig's James Bond, but on top of that, this was also a landmark in the Bond franchise in another regard, being the 25th official movie in the now nearly 60-year-old franchise. Thankfully, this film succeeds not only at being a perfect send-off, it's also an intimate love letter, I think, to hardcore Bond fans like myself. Where Skyfall gives you crowd-pleasing moments, which I love, don't get me wrong, but like revealing the DB5 car, which everyone kind of knows, even if they're not huge James Bond fans, even if they haven't seen the classic movies like Goldfinger and such that it's from, No Time to Die instead opts for more subtle references to the past that really only true Bond fans that have seen all the movies can really appreciate. Hans Zimmer weaves the melody of tunes from the classic Bond film On Her Majesty's Secret Service into his score, evoking the one time really in the original 20-film run when James Bond was truly in love, as he is now, for the second time in the Craig era, with Madeleine Swan, played by Lea Seydoux. The first time, of course, being Eva Green as Vesper Lynd in Casino Royale. On top of the music cues, the iconic line from On Her Majesty's Secret Service,
We have all the time in the world.
is also uttered by Bond multiple times in No Time to Die. I felt catered to in a way that was special and personal, as I knew many people in my theater wouldn't necessarily understand how much this line really meant. Ultimately, to me, this line meant that either Bond or Madeleine would not make it to the end of the film. It was a kind of fan service that was subtle and beautiful to experience, and the setup that felt somewhat forced in 2015 Spectre at the time suddenly, to me, feels really worth it in No Time to Die, as James Bond's happy life with Madeleine Swan is interrupted by the titular organization of the previous film itself. The fact that Bond is visiting Vesper Lynd's grave when the Spectre attack happens makes it all the more kind of poignant and personal, I think. It's beautiful to see Bond actually speak directly to Vesper in a way that we haven't really seen since she was killed. "I miss you," he says, finally confronting her and saying goodbye to her. Finally, I would say letting go, which completes his deepest arc, really, in the franchise, beautifully. And I almost like to think her grave blowing up immediately after he says goodbye symbolizes that he has finally moved on from her. That being said, her grave blowing up is also one of the most shocking moments in the movie. And it really kicks the action that follows into gear in incredible fashion. What ensues once the action does begin in this opening sequence of the film is some of the most pulse-pounding, but also simultaneously emotional action that I can really think of in movies. Seeing Bond have to get into action to survive is tough, since we know how mentally his world is beginning to shatter once he realizes that he may yet again have been betrayed by the rare person he's fallen for, as he was all those years ago by Vesper. After the most incredible, I would say, Bond opening sequence of the entire franchise, No Time to Die's title sequence kicks in, and it begins like a classic Bond film's titles do, particularly Dr. No, and I again feel respected as a Bond fan in a way that nearly brings me to tears of joy as I recognize the visual cues of Dr. No, the colorful dots, so in that title sequence slip into the 3D silhouetted characters from Casino Royale's title sequence, and even some direct nods to Thunderball as well. Even the reveal of the title of the film itself, No Time to Die, was a clear callback, I thought, to Casino Royale's title reveal, since down to the font and the way it was presented was the exact same way which it was in Casino Royale, which was fitting to bookend the Craig era, since Casino Royale, of course, was the first, and this is, of course, his last. So the amount of subtle deep cuts to older Bond films in this movie is truly a joy in and of itself for someone like myself, and there were definitely more than just the ones I mentioned even in just the title sequence alone, but those were the ones that really clearly stood out to me. When the title sequence ends, though, we are informed by text that there's been a massive time jump, something that most will compare to Avengers Endgame, since it was also a 5-year time jump in that. But also, as a Bond fan, it was cool to see this in the franchise for the second time, as the same thing happens immediately after the title sequence in what's my favorite pre-Craig era Bond film, GoldenEye, although that's 9 years later. And where things pick up in No Time to Die after the time jump also felt like a callback to GoldenEye, as we're introduced to a set of whimsical scientist characters working in a sort of secret government laboratory of sorts. It's sort of like the programmers were introduced to in GoldenEye. Just like Boris Grushenko in that film,
I am invincible!
Valdo Oberchev seems like a merely comical character, but we soon find out he's working for the enemy, who he knows will shortly arrive at his workplace to slaughter all of his co-workers in brutal fashion, and ultimately steal the secret government weapon that will set the plot of the film into motion. Heracles is a network of nanobots developed to pass through people's bloodstream like a virus, although harmlessly, until it reaches their intended DNA-based target, who will die instantly upon coming into contact with them. The weapon is all the more terrifying, of course, considering the day and age we're living in, and it shows just how in sync and relevant the James Bond franchise still is after all these decades, seeing as how this movie was basically finished already by the time that the pandemic even became a thing. So after breaking things off with Madeline, since Bond thinks she has betrayed him in the start of the film, we see he's retired to Jamaica. And Jamaica, I would argue, is the most synonymous location not based in the UK to the Bond franchise. So it felt so right for the franchise to return there for this grand finale of sorts. It is, of course, where the very first cinematic Bond adventure, Dr. No, mostly took place after all. Not to mention where the creator of James Bond, Ian Fleming, wrote all of the original Bond novels in his vacation house nicknamed other than GoldenEye, which the film was named after, since that one wasn't named after a book. I also couldn't have been more thrilled with who it is that brings James Bond back into action for this final time, and it was Felix Leiter, who's once again played by Jeffrey Wright, who we haven't seen since Quantum of Solace, or Casino Royale, and was sorely missed in Skyfall and Spectre, although he was at least name-dropped in Spectre. Though his time in this movie is rather brief, and he's kind of just brought back to die, the bond, no pun intended, but that he shares with James is truly palpable, and one gets the sense that he's the only person that James Bond ever truly trusted. While initially agreeing to help Felix, seemingly just to spite Lashana Lynch's Nomi, who has taken over as 007 since Bond has left active service, this mission becomes a lot more personal once Felix is killed. Leiter's death, while being the motivation needed for Bond to return to MI6, also foreshadows the grim and uncharted waters that this franchise will venture to in this 25th installment. Speaking of Lashana Lynch, she's a fantastic foil in my opinion to Daniel Craig throughout the film. Though people like to stir up controversy and call anything different woke nowadays, I think those who actually watch the film will see that nothing is being shoved down our throats here. Nomi is a great character who grows to respect Bond by the end of the film as he does her. Even before seeing the film, I couldn't really even begin to comprehend just the level of immaturity of the controversy. Bond left active service at the end of Spectre, so it was only fitting that someone else would become 007, in my opinion. I will say that those who I know who've seen the film didn't seem to have any issues with what many were calling woke before even seeing the movie. The biggest issue that many I know who actually have seen it do seem to have with this film, I think, is the villain isn't the most compelling, really, of the franchise, and his motivations are somewhat murky. So to that, I will say this. Rami Malek's Lucifer Safin is no Raul Silva from Skyfall, but I would say he is the most classic-feeling Bond villain within the Craig era. He's larger than life, disfigured, and straight up wants to take over the world, more or less, for reasons. Not to mention he does all this from easily the coolest secret lair in any modern Bond movie. Even the poison garden he cultivates on his island is somewhat of a deep cut for fans of the Ian Fleming novels. Though not used in the You Only Live Twice movie, in the novel by the same name, Blofeld himself hides away in a castle on an island that is covered in the most deadly, poisonous plants known to man. Bond actually has to make his way through the Garden of Death, that it's called in the book, to get to Blofeld's castle. Though significantly downsized and repurposed here in No Time to Die, the Poison Garden is an eerie location that is also stunning to behold and is mentioned to have been used previously by Christoph Waltz's Blofeld, truly solidifying its homage to Ian Fleming. Speaking of Christoph Waltz's Blofeld, he's back in this movie, and though he's really only in one scene, it is ultimately more effective than any scene he had in the previous film Spectre, I would say. It's really hard for me to pick a favorite part of this film, but the Blofeld scene is a serious contender. The build-up to this scene alone is masterful, showing both Bond and Madeline anticipate not only seeing Blofeld, but each other for the first time in 5 years. Madeline, who's secretly being sent there to kill Blofeld by Safin, leaves abruptly, deciding not to go through with the plan, but not before Bond touches her and unknowingly sets into motion his greatest enemy, Blofeld's demise. Seeing Bond have to actually try to reason with Blofeld starts out as tense and even somewhat amusing, but by the end escalates to all-out savagery. After his arch-nemesis reveals to him that once again he had orchestrated events to ruin Bond's life and that Madeline never actually betrayed him, Bond grabs Blofeld by the throat, telling him to die. Little does Bond know he has Heracles nanobots targeted to kill Blofeld after touching Madeline on his hands that will cause Blofeld to do just that, die. Though the ultimate Bond villain's death is admittedly rather abrupt, he does leave Bond questioning what Madeline has been hiding from him all this time, despite not being guilty of working for Spectre. To be honest, I will admit it was a bit somewhat unclear what it was that Blofeld was referring to that Madeline was hiding that would be the death of Bond. Was it simply that she was hiding her past involving Safin, or was it that she had his child 4 years ago, Bond's child 4 years ago? Ultimately, it was so baffling to wonder how Blofeld would even know all this, but of course he's right in both of these cases do factor in the end of the film in the death of James Bond. Before I dive into the tragically aforementioned ending, I want to discuss what happens immediately after Blofeld's death. When Madeline leaves, before Bond interrogates Blofeld, he asks her where she is going, and she tells him home. When he arrives at her home in Norway, he is prepared for a dangerous situation. What Bond finds, though, at first anyways, is not henchmen waiting to attack him, but Madeline and her daughter. Though Madeline tells Bond that the young girl Mathilde is not his, it's immediately apparent to the audience from the girl's Daniel Craig resembling piercing blue eyes that this is in fact the daughter of James Bond. And when Madeline and Mathilde are eventually captured by Safin, it sets into motion the most emotionally charged and thrilling third act in a Bond film ever. Nomi deciding to go along to Safin's island to help Bond save his family and, well, the world, was a wonderful conclusion to the relationship, I thought, between the two rival 007s. The fact that she decides to even have Bond reinstated as 007 makes it hard not to love Nomi by the end of the film. I honestly wouldn't be opposed to the next film in the franchise focusing on whether she and she be 007 or not, and if it focused on her. Although it's hard for me to see them making a movie in this franchise that doesn't include James Bond himself. But only time will tell, I suppose. One more moment of hers I also really thought was a genuinely great callback to earlier films was when Bond and her were injected with a tracking device by Q before dropping down to Saffin's Island. Bond, who's rather numb to this, having done this in the previous movies, is sort of numb to it at this point, and he's more annoyed than pained by it. But whereas Naomi, when she gets injected, she reacts audibly pained, kind of like Bond does in Casino Royale.
Ow.
And I just loved how this little interaction with Q highlighted sort of the differences in the two agents' experience levels, while also kind of providing a nice callback in one of the film's many moments of levity, which never really felt forced. And speaking in this film's levity, it excels in the department of classic Bond quips and puns, more so than any previous Craig Bond films. Not since Xenia Onatopp enjoyed a good squeeze, as put by Pierce Brosnan's Bond in GoldenEye, has a henchman in the franchise received such a fitting end delivered by Bond himself before topping it off with such a fitting and punny one-liner. Not to mention that when Bond exclaims that Q's watch really blew the henchman in this film's Cyclops' mind, he just made his way through droves of henchmen up a staircase, one massively long tracking shot, echoing what director Cary Joji Fukunaga did in Season 1, Episode 4 of True Detective. Again, that one shot is a serious contender for my favorite part in the movie, especially combined with the amazing Hans Zimmer score. Like, just, wow. How much better of a way is there to show what's ultimately James Bond's final stand against a massive drove of henchmen before he bites it? As I said, though, never before in a James Bond movie have the stakes been more personal. And Saffin holding Mathilde in his arms as Bond is forced to negotiate with him for his daughter's life is another absolutely standout scene where Daniel Craig, I thought, especially shines, but even Rami Malek, despite, as I mentioned, playing a somewhat underdeveloped character, really has quite the presence and gives the classic Bond villains of old an eerily real-world feel here. His delivery of his dialogue is quite captivating and also chilling. For some reason, the moment where he throws the pillow up in the air to have it shot by his henchmen, implying that he could do the same with Mathilde if Bond doesn't cooperate, because she's light as a feather, as he so gleefully puts it, had me on the edge of my seat. Just because it felt like such a wonderfully maniacal, classic movie villain moment that I feel villains in films are lacking a lot these days. Because of these more personal than ever before stakes, as I've said a bunch, it doesn't feel jarring when Bond gets a little more brutal than we've seen him in the past few movies here in order to protect those he loves. In one case, more so to avenge than protect. And No Time to Die is filled with moments that will go down as some of James Bond's just coolest, most memorable, and I would say straight up
with a twist,
badass moments. Certainly the part where he gets revenge for Felix on Logan Ash. Billy Magnuson's character is somewhat amusing and comical at first, but instantly hateable as soon as he turns on James Bond and Felix. So Bond killing him in cold blood, pushing the car onto him, is an extremely crowd-pleasing moment that I loved. Unlike Ash, though, Felix's one other CIA friend in the film, Ana de Armas's Paloma, who I can't believe I haven't mentioned till now, is an absolute delight, and I only wish we got a bit more of her. She made enough of an impression in just one sequence that I wouldn't be surprised to see her pop up in many people's favorite all-time Bond girl lists in the future. But back to the aforementioned brutality that Bond inflicts on his enemies near the end of this film. In the final standoff with Saffin, after taking multiple gunshots that felt like they hurt me as much as they did Bond, as I was starting to kind of process and suspect the unthinkable happening, Bond pins down Saffin and proceeds to snap his arm like a breadstick. Without being gory per se, this really felt like some of the most brutal violence we've seen in a Bond film actually done by Bond himself, outside of maybe License to Kill, because that one is something. And I freaking loved it. Of course, what came next is the hardest part of the film to swallow, the death of James Bond. In many ways, I think this was the harder death to handle for me personally, even more so than Tony Stark, who's another one of my favorite movie characters. Whereas in Endgame, you don't really know Tony's fate until a moment or so before it comes to fruition. Bond's death is intentionally made evident miles ahead. When Bond is told by Safin after breaking his arm that Safin has infected both of them with Heracles nanobots targeted to kill Madeline, and in turn her daughter Mathilde and his daughter, both Bond and the audience know he can't leave the island alive. After dispassionately putting 2 bullets in Safin's head, Bond proceeds back up to the control room where he must reopen the shield doors of the base after his first attempt was undone by Safin in order for the incoming missiles to destroy Heracles once and for all. Shots of Bond's blood dripping on the floor were hard for me to see. As I said, at this point, we all knew what was coming. Ben Whishaw's Q, who's normally comic relief in these films, provides some of the most heartfelt moments here and in this last act. Over the comms, Bond and Q communicate one final time as Bond completes his last mission. Hearing how choked up Q is getting made me feel almost as bad for him as I did Bond, since it really just felt so genuine to me. When Q puts Madeline on the comms, we get some of the best acting, I would say, probably ever given by someone in the role of a Bond girl. Lea Seydoux wasn't even my favorite Bond girl in Spectre per se, but her performance really hits home in No Time to Die, I think, especially in the scene where she is saying goodbye to James Bond once she realized he's been poisoned. "We just need more time," she says, which leads Bond to saying one last time, "You have all the time in the world." Daniel Craig in these final moments is absolutely masterful and honestly Oscar-worthy in my opinion. And it's not just because I'm a James Bond fan. Maybe a little bit, but I don't think so. As he stares into the sky in a close-up shot waiting for the missiles to obliterate him, he looks almost at peace with tears of both sadness and joy, just barely held back when Madeline tells him finally that Mathilde does have his eyes. And then James Bond says his final words in response, and those are, "I know." I think he says that twice. And I know some people may be rubbed the wrong way by James Bond definitively being killed off. But doesn't a cinematic icon like James Bond, after 25 movies, deserve a proper and definitive end? I think so. And there was never going to be a more perfect film for him to go out, nor a more beautiful and emotionally fulfilling way for it to happen. After a fittingly modest and unofficial memorial service at MI6 for Bond, we get one last scene as Madeline promises to tell her daughter, Mathilde, and James Bond's daughter, the story of her father, James Bond. They drive into the tunnel resembling the iconic gun barrel logo from Bond, seeing the iconic gun barrel recontextualized throughout the Craig films multiple times, actually, even in this movie. Before that, it felt so fitting for this to be the final image we see in this continuity. And then finally, the actual 1969 song, "We Have All the Time in the World" from On Her Majesty's Secret Service, finally plays in full after being teased and alluded to the entire movie. And honestly, I don't know what other word I could use to describe how I felt as a Bond fan, especially as this film came to a close, other than perfect. So, yeah, I'm giving No Time to Die a perfect 10 out of 10. So, thanks so much for watching, as always. Please like, share, and subscribe. Take care. Bye.